My father owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Calgary, and he stood up at my wedding reception with a champagne glass in his hand and told 300 guests that I would never see a dime of the family trust, because I'd married a man who fixed furnaces for a living. My husband didn't flinch. He just smiled, set down his fork, and said he'd never asked for a dime in the first place. 4 months later, my parents found out exactly who they'd been begging for a bailout, and the name on the contract made my mother drop her coffee cup on the marble floor of my father's own boardroom. My name is Avery. I'm 31. I grew up in a house on a hill in Mount Royal, the kind of neighborhood where the hedges are trimmed into perfect rectangles and nobody's garage door is ever left open. My father, Desmond Calloway, built his empire out of strip malls and office towers across Alberta, starting with one parking lot he bought at 26 and turning it into a real estate holding company worth more than I could ever wrap my head around. My mother, Lorraine, never worked a day that I can remember, but she ran our household like a hostile takeover, every dinner party a negotiation, every friendship a strategic alliance. In my family, nothing was free, not affection, not approval, certainly not money. My father used to say that love without leverage was just a liability waiting to happen, and he said it the way other dads quote hockey stats, like it was simple common sense everyone agreed on. My older brother Reed was being groomed to take over the company, and I was being groomed to marry well, ideally someone with a name that would look good engraved on a building. I was supposed to be decorative and obedient. I tried for years to be both. Then I met Theo. He was fixing a furnace in the basement of a coffee shop I used to write in. Back when I still thought I might be a journalist instead of whatever directionless thing I'd actually become. He had grease on his forearms and a laugh that didn't sound like it was calculating anything, and when he found out who my father was, he didn't get that look people usually got, that little flicker of math happening behind their eyes. He just asked if I wanted to get a coffee somewhere that wasn't infested with a broken furnace. Theo ran his own small HVAC business. He'd built it from nothing after he aged out of foster care at 18. No family money, no safety net, just a used van and a willingness to climb into attics in February. He was patient and steady, and he listened to me in a way nobody in my family ever had, like my thoughts were worth the time it took to finish them. I fell for him slowly and then all at once, the way you fall for someone who makes you feel like a person instead of an asset. My father hated him immediately and completely. He didn't even pretend otherwise. He called Theo the contractor at every family dinner, refused to learn how to pronounce his last name correctly even after I corrected him 4 times, and once asked me, in front of my own mother, what exactly I thought I was doing slumming it with hired help. When I told him we were engaged, he didn't yell. That would have been easier. He just got very quiet, set down his scotch, and told me I was making the worst financial decision of my life. Not the worst decision, the worst financial decision, like that was the only category that mattered. I should have known the wedding would be a trap. I just didn't want to believe it. He insisted on paying for the venue, the ballroom of the Fairmont, the one with the view of the river and the mountains in the distance. And I told myself it was a peace offering. I should have recognized it for what it actually was. A stage. My father didn't do anything without an audience. He'd spent 30 years building a reputation as a man who controlled every room he walked into, and he wasn't about to let his only daughter's wedding be the one event where he didn't get the final word. The reception was beautiful, I'll give him that. White peonies everywhere, a string trio playing something soft and classical, candlelight bouncing off crystal glass, 280 guests. Half of them my parents' business associates who I'd met maybe twice in my life. Theo wore a suit he'd bought off the rack and altered himself because he didn't trust tailors with money he could put toward his business instead, and he looked to me like the only real thing in the entire room. My father waited until the toasts. Of course he did. He stood up, tapped his glass with a fork until the room went silent, and I felt my stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. Because I knew that posture, I'd seen it in boardroom photos, the posture of a man about to deliver bad news wrapped in a smile. He congratulated us. Then he said that as much as he loved his daughter, he believed in accountability, and that a marriage built on disparity, his word disparity, wasn't one he could in good conscience continue to subsidize. He announced, to 300 people, that the Calloway Family Trust, the one I'd technically been a beneficiary of since birth, would be permanently revoked effective that evening. No inheritance. No safety net. He said he hoped Theo's furnace business was as solid as he claimed because it was all I'd have from now on. The silence after that was the loudest sound I've ever heard. I felt my face go hot, my eyes sting, 280 pairs of eyes on me waiting to see how I'd break. And then Theo stood up beside me, calm as anything, and said he'd never wanted the trust in the first place, that he'd married Avery, not her father's bank account, and that we'd be just fine on our own. He raised his glass to my father and said, with this small, unreadable smile, "Good luck with everything, Desmond." Then he sat back down and put his hand over mine under the table, and I realized he wasn't even angry. He looked almost amused. I didn't understand that smile until 4 months later. We moved into Theo's place, a narrow 2-bedroom in Bridgeland, with a view of nothing but the neighbor's fence, and honestly, those first months were some of the happiest of my life. No performance, no audience, just the two of us eating cheap pad thai on the floor, because we hadn't bought a kitchen table yet. I picked up freelance writing work. Theo's business kept growing, slowly, the way real things grow. I didn't think about my father much. I told myself I didn't care what happened to him, but things were happening to him. I just didn't know it yet. My mother started calling me again around the 2nd month, which should have told me something was wrong, because my mother didn't call to chat. She called with information she wanted, dressed up as concern. She mentioned, almost too casually, that the company was going through a restructuring period. That my brother Reed had taken on more responsibility, while Dad focuses on strategy. I'd find out later that strategy meant my father had been quietly hiding from the board for weeks, because he didn't know how to tell them what Reed had done. Reed had always been allowed to fail upward. He went to business school because it was expected, not because he had any particular talent for it, and my father had been propping him up for years, smoothing over his mistakes, signing off on decisions Reed didn't fully understand because admitting his golden son was in over his head would have meant admitting he'd built his succession plan on sand. Reed had pushed the company into an aggressive expansion the year before. 3 new commercial developments, all financed on variable rate construction loans, all betting on a market that didn't cooperate. Then the Bank of Canada raised rates again, twice in 1 year, faster than anyone had modeled for. Reed had structured the loans without proper hedging, something even I, with zero business education, understood was a catastrophic oversight the moment Theo explained it to me later. The carrying costs on 3 half-finished properties ballooned past anything the company's cash flow could absorb. 2 anchor tenants pulled out of lease agreements when the developments fell behind schedule. The company's primary lender, spooked by a credit downgrade, called in a covenant violation and gave my father 90 days to either refinance or face a forced asset sale that would have gutted 3 decades of work. My father went to every bank in Calgary. Every single one turned him down or offered terms so punishing they amounted to the same thing as a refusal. The Callaway name, which had once gotten him a table at any restaurant in the city, and a seat on every board worth sitting on, suddenly meant nothing to risk committees looking at a balance sheet that didn't lie the way reputations could. I didn't know any of this in real time. I found out about most of it after, pieced together from things my mother let slip and things Theo eventually told me himself, sitting at our new kitchen table. We'd bought one by then, with 2 glasses of wine and a look on his face like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally setting it down. What I did know in the moment was that my mother started showing up unannounced. The first time, she stood on our porch in a coat that cost more than our rent and looked around our narrow little house, like she'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Entirely. She didn't apologize for my father. She never apologized for my father. Instead, she talked around the edges of things, asked careful questions about Theo's business, asked whether we had connections in private lending. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. That was true then. The second time she cried. I'd never seen my mother cry, not once in 31 years, and it unsettled me more than anything she could have said. She told me the company was in trouble, real trouble, the kind that ends with your name on the news for the wrong reasons. She asked, without quite asking, whether Theo might know anyone. I remember feeling this strange mix of vindication and grief, watching the woman who'd spent my entire childhood teaching me that love was a transaction now, trying to make a transaction out of the one relationship she'd dismissed as worthless. I told Theo about it that night, expecting him to be angry or smug or something. He just nodded slowly and asked me a strange question. He asked what I'd think of him if it turned out he'd known more about my father's business than he'd ever let on. I didn't understand what he meant until 2 days later, when he sat me down properly and told me the truth. Theo's furnace business had been real. It still was real. He still loved the work, still went out on calls himself most weeks, but it had never been the whole picture. Years before I met him, a former client, an older woman, whose furnace he'd fixed for free one brutal February when she couldn't afford it, turned out to be the widow of a man who'd built a private investment fund out of Vancouver. She'd taken a liking to Theo, to his work ethic and his refusal to ever cut corners, and over the years had quietly brought him in, taught him the business, eventually made him a partner, and then when she passed, left him controlling interest in the fund itself. It operated under the name Northbridge Capital, a private lending and acquisitions firm that specialized in exactly the kind of distressed commercial real estate situation my father's company was now drowning in. Theo kept it deliberately quiet, partly because the work itself required discretion, and partly, he admitted, because he liked being seen as just the guy who fixed furnaces. He liked that people talked to him without doing the math first. He said he'd planned to tell me eventually, when it felt right, and that watching my father humiliate me at our own wedding had made him decide that eventually could wait a little longer. I sat with that for a long time. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I understood why he'd kept it close. But there was something dizzying about realizing the man my father had dismissed, as beneath our family, was quietly worth more than the entire Callaway portfolio. Northbridge had been the firm my father's mortgage broker eventually approached, the only serious offer left on the table after every traditional lender said no. Theo told me he almost turned it down without even looking at the file, just on principle, until he saw the name Callaway Holdings on the cover sheet and decided, in his words, that some things deserved to be handled personally. He didn't tell my father who he was. Northbridge negotiated through lawyers and a regional director, the way these things usually go, and my father, desperate and out of options, agreed to terms that gave Northbridge significant control. A seat on the board, restructuring authority, oversight on any future major financial decision, and first right of refusal on company assets if the loan covenants were breached again. He signed it on a Friday afternoon in his own boardroom, the same boardroom where I used to sit on the floor as a kid doing homework while he took calls, believing he was dealing with some faceless fund manager in Vancouver who'd never set foot in Calgary. The final closing meeting was scheduled for the following week, in person, because the size of the deal required signatures witnessed on site. I wasn't invited, obviously, why would I be? But Theo asked if I wanted to come anyway, as his guest, since as controlling partner he was entitled to bring whoever he liked. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. I wore the navy dress I'd worn to my own engagement dinner, the one my mother used to say washed me out. I wanted my father to recognize it. I wanted him to know exactly who was walking through that door. The boardroom hadn't changed. Same dark wood table, same view of the river, same oil painting of my grandfather scowling down from the wall like he was still personally overseeing every deal. My father sat at the head of the table with Reed beside him, both of them in suits that looked slightly too big now, like the men inside them had shrunk. My mother sat off to the side the way she always did at business meetings, present but not really included. When Theo walked in, my father stood automatically, the way he always did for important guests, hand already extending for a handshake before his eyes actually landed on Theo's face. I watched the exact moment recognition hit him. His hand froze halfway out, the color left his face in stages, like watching a light dim instead of switch off. "You," he said, just that one way, calm and pleasant like they were meeting for the first time. "Good to see you again, Desmond. I believe we have some paperwork." My mother's coffee cup hit the marble floor before she'd even fully processed what she was looking at, just an instinctive flinch reaction, the cup sliding out of her hand and shattering near her feet while nobody moved to clean it up because nobody could look away from my father's face. Reed actually laughed, this short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, before he understood it wasn't a joke, and then he went pale too. My father tried to recover the way he always recovered, by talking, fast and confident, about how this was clearly some kind of conflict of interest, how surely there were grounds to revisit the terms now that the personal relationship was disclosed. Theo let him finish. Then he said, very quietly, that nothing about the terms had changed, that Northbridge had evaluated the deal purely on the numbers, the same way they evaluated every deal, and that the only thing that had changed was that my father now knew who was sitting across the table from him. "You once told my wife that love without leverage was a liability," Theo said. "I just wanted you to understand exactly how much leverage you signed away." My father looked at me then, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see control in his face. I saw fear, real fear, the kind that comes from realizing the ground you built your whole identity on was never as solid as you thought. He asked me, almost pleading, if I'd known. I told him the truth, that I hadn't, not until days before, but that it didn't change anything about what he'd done at my wedding, in front of everyone I knew, to a man worth more than our entire family's net worth, because he couldn't see past a pair of work boots. I didn't gloat. I want to be honest about that, because I think the version of this story where I stood there and laughed in his face would have made me feel powerful for about 10 minutes, and hollow for a lot longer than that. I just told him that Theo and I would be heading the restructuring oversight personally, that decisions about the company's future would now run through us, and that if he wanted any say in how things proceeded, he'd need to start treating the people in this room with the respect he'd spent his whole life withholding. The months after that were not some cinematic montage of revenge. They were slow and procedural and occasionally exhausting, full of board meetings and audits, and Reed having to actually learn the business he'd been pretending to run for years, this time with real oversight he couldn't talk his way around. We didn't take the company from my father outright. We didn't need to. The leverage did the work for us. He kept a title and a salary, but every major decision passed through Northbridge first, which meant it passed through us. The strip malls stayed open, the employees kept their jobs. Reed, surprisingly, actually started showing up properly, maybe because for the first time someone was checking his work instead of covering for it. My mother never apologized either, not really, not in so many words. But she started showing up to things differently, asking about my life instead of my usefulness, sitting in our narrow kitchen in Bridgeland without commenting on the size of it. I don't think she became a different person. I think she just finally understood that the version of respect built on money had an expiry date, and the version built on actually showing up didn't. Theo still goes out on furnace calls some weeks, even now, even though he doesn't have to. He says it keeps him honest. I asked him once, early on, if he regretted not telling me sooner who he really was, and he said no. He said he wanted me to fall for the man who fixed furnaces, not the man who could buy and sell my father's company, because he's needed to know for his own sake which version of him I'd actually choose. I think about that wedding toast sometimes, my father standing there with his champagne glass, so certain that money was the only inheritance worth having. I have a different kind of inheritance now, not trust funds or office towers. Just a marriage built on two people who chose each other before either of us had anything to prove it. And a quiet, permanent knowledge that real security was never something he could have given me in the first place, because he never understood what it actually was.